A rented copy of a summer blockbuster slides into a VCR. The picture holds steady on the television. A blank cassette waits in a second deck, wired through yellow, red, and white RCA cables. The record button drops. Minutes later, the duplicate plays back on the same television, and the image lurches. Brightness rises, falls, rolls. The original remains stable. The copy cannot settle. Same tape, same hardware, but something else seems very different. You watched a movie and the recording hardware saw instructions, but these instructions were lies. Inside the vertical blanking interval, a stretch of signal the television was never built to care about, set hidden pulses on every protected line. John O'Ryan, the engineer who designed those pulses, had spent 6 years at Ampex managing advanced camera development, the exact domain where video signals, recording paths, and gain control circuits set side by side. He founded Macrovision Corporation in Silicon Valley in February 1983 and filed a patent in April 1985. What he had found, in his own later account, was one subsystem in the VCR that was not in the television set. Automatic gain control on the record path was that subsystem. When a VCR recorded from another source, a circuit measured the incoming reference information and adjusted signal strength so the tape would carry a stable picture. The circuit had been designed for honest inputs, as engineers building VCRs in the 70s and 80s assumed the signal arriving at the record head would behave within the same range as a broadcast or cable source produced. Ryan's pulses in the blanking interval, a pseudosync tip at -40 IRE, paired with a gain control pulse at +100, 7 pairs on every protected line, presented an apparent signal around 350% of normal. This circuit obeyed and the record gain was cut roughly to 30%. A television programming Playback ignored the same pulses. Its automatic gain control was keyed only during horizontal sync and never sampled the blanking interval where the trap had been placed. So the consequence, on the original tape, the movie looks fine. On the duplicate, the picture comes apart. This was merely a 15-month-old trick that had commercial reasons behind it. On January 17, 1984, the United States Supreme Court had ruled against Universal Studios and Sony Corporation of America versus Universal Studios, holding by a 5-4 majority that home recording of free broadcast television was fair use and that the VCR had substantial non-infringing purposes. Jack Valenti, president of the Motion Picture Association of America, had told the House Judiciary Subcommittee 2 years earlier that the VCR was to the American film producer what the Boston Strangler was to a woman home alone. His strong words didn't make a difference. Hollywood lost in court and a new answer arrived inside the signal. Embassy Home Entertainment shipped the first commercial deployment in April 1985. The movie The Cotton Club, a film by Coppola that Embassy had paid $4.7 million for home video rights, reached VHS and Betamax, with Macrovision's analog copy protection written into every duplicated master. Ryan later pointed to Universal's 1988 VHS release of Back to the Future as the tipping point for the major studios, and licensing followed. An agreement between Macrovision and Buena Vista decided the fee, no more than 6 cents per unit. By the company's own accounting in 2005, more than 4.7 billion VHS cassettes and 5.5 billion DVDs had carried the protection. This protection didn't make the tapes look any different. The cassette was identical to any blank on the same shelf. The lock in the movie arrived on the same strip of tape, written in by specially modified duplication recorders whose own gain control had been bypassed so the pulses could pass through intact. This was different from what had been done before, which was external systems, a key, a dongle, a seal, a cabinet door. This one was neatly folded into the same stream as the movie itself, so ownership of the physical artifact no longer implied full command of the signal inside it. Then the federal government wrote the vulnerability into law. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, signed on October 28, 1998, contained a section drafted specifically around the Macrovision pulse pattern. Once its provisions phased in over the following 18 months, any analog VCR imported or manufactured for sale in the United States had to include automatic gain control circuitry that responded to those pulses. A VCR designed to ignore the trap would be illegal to sell. The Electronic Frontier Foundation later summarized the arrangement in dry terms. A weakness in consumer hardware had been preserved by statute because a licensing business depended on it. Harm fell hardest on customers the statute didn't mean to affect. If you were watching a DVD through a VCR pass-through, a common arrangement on televisions with a single composite input, saw brightness pumping on legitimate playback because the DVD player was inserting the pulses, and the VCR in the signal chain was responding to them. DVD recorders mistook the mechanical instability of worn home tapes for Macrovision and refused to copy a family camcorder transfer. Even rear projection televisions and TV VCR combos produced their own variations of the same failure. Inside the room, the suspects were all wrong because the blank tape got the blame. The tracking knob got turned. The heads got cleaned, the cable chain got reseated, the second VCR got swapped for another. Nothing helped because nothing in the room was actually broken. Rental clerks would hear the same complaints from customer after customer and had nothing useful to say. Meanwhile, for anyone determined to cross the line, you could still do something. A box from SEMA Products in Illinois sold for around $150 and stripped the pulses on its way to the recorder. A black case stabilizer called R12 sold for even less. Professional duplication shops used a $500 time-based corrector that regenerated clean sync and erased the protection as a side effect. When Macrovision sued SEMA in 2006, the federal judge granting the injunction put this situation in the form of a question. If Macrovision's technology were not effective, why would SEMA manufacture devices to circumvent it? Basically, the protection stopped grandmothers and everyday users while professionals walked through it without breaking much of a sweat. Eventually, tapes stopped being used, but DVD players carried the logic forward through a 40-bit disk sector cipher called the Content Scramble System and a 2-bit trigger in each navigation pack that told the player's analog output encoder whether to insert Macrovision pulses on the composite and component lines. John Johansson and two collaborators published the program known as DCSS on October 6, 1999, breaking the disk cipher. By the end of 2013, no new Blu-ray player could ship with analog outputs at all. Macrovision Corporation became Rovi in 2009, the brand by then too closely tied to consumer frustration to remain the same. Along the way, it had acquired Gemstar TV Guide for roughly $2.8 billion, a valuation only possible because the small waveform trick had funded a decade of expansion into the wider media rights industry. Then, Rovi absorbed TiVo in 2016 and took its name, merged with Xperi in 2020, and spun off its patent business as ADEA Incorporated in October 2022. The foundational Ryan patents filed between 1984 and 1994 had now expired under United States patent terms. Sometimes a format can carry a rule that only becomes visible when someone tries to cross a boundary the format was designed to protect. Macrovision was not the first system to hide enforcement inside a video signal, but it was the first to reach the scale of every Hollywood rental shelf, and the first to be written into federal law as a required feature of consumer hardware. The tape is gone, the waveform trick is gone. The architecture remains. Modern media reaches modern screens through layers of authentication, encryption, and handshakes that decide what plays and what doesn't. And the decision happens inside the signal itself before any image arrives. The tape played. The copy broke. The system worked exactly as designed.